Welcome to another edition of the Overheard podcast from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. On Overheard each month, we discuss issues related to national security implications of intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. My name is Phil Wasilewski, and I am the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare. We are back after a hiatus for the holidays to start our Overheard podcast series for 2025 with a look at some irregular warfare lessons learned from America's experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq after the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the wars that followed. This is a topic of great personal interest to me. I served in these wars, not only as a CIA paramilitary officer, but I also served in Iraq and Afghanistan as a colonel in the United States Marine Corps, being mobilized as a reservist. In both capacities, I worked with the peoples of those nations from the local to national level and got to know several of them very well. At one point in each of those two wars, over 100,000 Americans, military personnel, diplomats, intelligence officers, contractors, and others, were deployed to either Afghanistan or Iraq. Almost all lived in self-sustaining bubbles, separated from the societies they were there to help and isolated from the local people by both security considerations, but also by the fact that few out of those 100,000 plus Americans could speak any of the local or regional languages. In many cases, American efforts, military and civilian, in those two countries were directed not at working with existing indigenous structures, but at changing them to an extent that they no longer reflected or were supported by their own societies. In both Iraq and Afghanistan, we built an army in our own image and dependent on our support. We were surprised when each fell apart without that support. This should not have been a surprise. The same thing happened in South Vietnam in 1975. To try and learn some lessons from these events, the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Department of Defense's Irregular Warfare Center hosted a conference in September 2024 at the U.S. Naval Institute in Annapolis, Maryland, on the grounds of the Naval Academy. The conference featured several guest speakers, panel discussions, and academic paper presentations on topics ranging from information operations to intelligence activities. Some of the most important papers presented were on how American forces interacted with indigenous military, paramilitary, militia, and police forces to help counter the insurgencies. Today, two of the authors of those papers are with us to discuss their work and lessons to be learned from our experiences in counterinsurgency operations following 9/11. Our first guest is Dr. Diane Zohri, whose paper, Insights from the Battlefield, Iraqi Security After the Fall of Saddam Hussein, covered lessons learned from working with Iraqi police and militia forces. Dr. Diane Zohri is a military veteran, defense industry expert, and a PhD in political science, who's dedicated to advancing global security and strategic education. Drawing from her experience in Iraq, she will give us some firsthand insights into the complexities of military operations and U.S. defense policy, as well as a deep understanding of the evolving challenges of modern counterinsurgency. Diane, welcome to Overheard.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And also joining us today is Dr. Arturo Munoz, whose paper, The Rise and Fall of Afghanistan's Local Defense Forces, describes the promise, but also the roadblocks that many of us faced in trying to develop local self-defense forces to fight the Taliban. I say us because Arturo and I worked together in Afghanistan on several occasions. And Dr. Munoz is a retired CIA officer who has worked at RAND Corporation since retirement. Currently, he is a RAND adjunct. He has focused his professional research on national security issues, particularly counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, psychological operations, and propaganda. Afghanistan was an area of special interest for Dr. Munoz. He did field research there and published several studies on that area. Welcome is Overheard, and it's good to talk with you again.
Yeah, good to be here.
Now, I'd like to start by asking Dr. Zohri to give our listeners a summary of her paper on the utilization of local police forces and militias during the Iraq War. Diane, the floor is yours. We'd love to hear what you had to say in your paper.
Sure. So during the Iraq War, Iraq's police and militias were used to fill some of the security gaps that the coalition forces could not cover. And while the police were intended to provide local law enforcement, they were often poorly trained, underfunded, and at times infiltrated by sectarian groups. Meanwhile, we found that Iraq's militias, particularly those that were tied to political factions or ethnic groups, played dual roles. Sometimes they were working with coalition forces, and other times they were pursuing their own agendas. So the US forces attempted a lot of different strategies. One of those was embedding advisors, another one was partnering with tribal groups, and sometimes it was creating specialized police units. But what we found was that many of those were effective in the short term, but long term institutionalization was a huge challenge.
Thank you very much. Arturo, you focused on Afghanistan, but also on roughly the same topic, how the local population can defend itself. Please tell us about your paper and the efforts that were undertaken to create local militia forces to fight the Taliban.
Between 2009 and 2010, Seth Jones and I conducted research in Afghanistan to determine whether local self-defense forces were a viable counterinsurgency mechanism. At that time, the Taliban insurgency was gaining momentum, and we were convinced that to win, local Afghans had to take part in the fight. The results were published in 2010 in a RAND publication called Afghanistan's Local War, Building Local Defense Forces. And our conclusion was that the traditional Pashtun Arbakai, which are like village guards, they did provide a strong base for creating local self-defense forces for counterinsurgency. Now, the Arbakai, they go back centuries, and they're village guards, and they're organized by the local council of elders. That's called the Jirga. So they come under the authority of the Jirga, the council of elders. Now, they're unpaid. You don't get paid to do this. They're volunteers. And traditionally, they defend against bandits. They protect the crops during harvest, because apparently theft of crops is a big problem, during harvest time. So they patrol the territory of the village to keep thieves out, keep bandits out. And also they protect the territorial integrity of the different ethnic territories by keeping out members of other tribes and keeping out members of other ethnic groups. And they can be armed. Sometimes they patrol just with a big staff, a big stick. But as conflict increased, they became armed, and they're already organized at the local level by the local society. So the idea was, let's use these people for counterinsurgency. And I talked to Arbakai commanders, and they actually agreed with our idea that it would be a good idea to use the Arbakai for counterinsurgency. Now, they made some recommendations. They said the CDF, the Civil Defense Force that you would create based on the Arbakai model, that it had to come under the authority of the Jirga, and to have credibility, and for the people to participate in it, with enthusiasm. Their local elders approved this thing, so it had to be under the Jirga. They also said, do not put them in uniform, because there is resentment in the countryside against the national government, and Kabul is seen as a distant center of power that's actually kind of alien to the realities and the desires of the people at the local level. And also they have the local police have a tradition of corruption. So they said, do not put them in uniform. And then the last thing they said is, do not give them a salary. And the reason they said, do not give the CDF, the Civil Defense Forces, a salary, is you're going to attract the wrong kind of people. You're going to get mercenaries. who just want to fight for the money. And you don't want mercenaries. It's the wrong motivation. The other thing they said is you're going to create jealousy within the village between those who have a regular salary and those who do not. So it's not a good idea to create a class of people who now receive a regular government salary as opposed to the other people who don't have the salary. And then the last thing they said is, the Taliban has a lot of illegal activities that they make money out of, like kidnappings, the drug trade, heroin trade. They have sources of money. So if you're going to offer a salary, the Taliban could come and offer more money because they do have, sources of funding. They can do it. So those were the three conditions that the Arbakai commanders said we should follow. Now, I met with some former Taliban commanders who had reconciled with the government, and I floated the idea of using Arbakai for counterinsurgency. And actually, although they had reconciled with the government, they were still sympathetic to the Taliban ideals. And actually, I actually started the interview calling them former Taliban, and they said, no, we're not former Taliban. We're still Taliban. We're just not fighting. So that's their attitude. So when I presented the idea of using Arbakai for counterinsurgency to our former adversaries, they actually didn't like it. And one of them said, very seriously, do not use our culture for your political purposes. Now, he said it in a negative way, but I actually took it as a positive because I said, in my mind, I didn't argue with the guy, but I said, well, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We are trying to use your culture for our political purposes, which is the counterinsurgency campaign. So I then, it just confirmed in my mind, yeah, we're on the right track. Then
Arturo,
go ahead.
I've got a question for you. I was in Afghanistan at the same time, and our podcast listeners will recognize Seth Jones, who's been on our podcast before, and is currently vice president over at the Center for the Study of International Studies. You took this to Kabul. You briefed both the U.S. military first and then the Afghan government. Could you tell us what the reactions were of both the U.S. military, the Afghan government, and then what became of this?
Absolutely. The U.S. government, we briefed the SOCOM commander, General Reeder, Seth and I jointly, and he liked it. He thought it was a good proposal. And the SOCOM staff that was there at the briefing in Kabul, they were all very positive. They were saying, yes, we should do this. The whole idea of civil defense forces, nobody had objections to it in the U.S. military. Now, the Afghans was different. So I talked to Ashraf Ghani. This was before he was president. And he was very negative. He said, no, I don't like civil defense forces. Because they're going to become militias. And militias has been the bane of Afghan history. And he said, and he emphasized, no, the future of Afghanistan is a large, modern, uniformed army. We don't want to hand out weapons to tribal people. So right there from the beginning, you had this tension, between two different views of how to do counterinsurgency that quite frankly never got resolved. Now, the initial audience, the SOCOM audience, again, they were very receptive to it, but you got to coordinate this proposal. You got to coordinate it with the U.S. Embassy. You got to coordinate it with CENTCOM. There's a lot of coordination that goes on with any kind of program that you're going to try to implement. So what happened was along the way, this coordination process, you have different equities and you have different objectives. And then trying to reconcile those was really difficult. So at the end of the day, the way the final program was implemented didn't reflect the recommendations of the Arbakai commanders. First of all, they didn't put them under they did coordinate with the Jirgas, the elders, but the local self-defense forces were put under the authority of the police. And in fact, the compromise that was made with the Karzai administration was they created the program under the name Village Stability Operations, but then the whole idea of the village stability operations are going to be included in Afghan local police. So you would see in the official messages VSO/ALP. So, but that's contrary to what the local Arbakai commander said. We don't want to be ALP. We don't want to be Afghan local police. But but that's the compromise with the central government. The whole Arbakai system that we set up was meant to transition to Afghan local police. So that was, one contradiction. The other contradiction was they put him in uniform. And then the last contradiction was they paid him a salary. So sure enough, what you did get is you did get mercenary type people. You did get different kinds of abuse of the system by people putting up their relatives, that kind of thing, just to make money. Now, in spite of those things, I would argue that the VSO, which was what the program became, was effective. And there have been studies. Rand did some studies, and they said, they are actually being effective in pushing the Taliban out of those certain areas. However, as the war went on, we went further and further away from the original concept of village self-defense. And one of the things that happened was they emphasized protecting the main population centers and the main roads, which were not, the traditional tribal areas. And the focus became defensive. And we were moving away from the whole idea of village self-defense. Basically, the U.S. Army did not abandon the conventional view of war. And the whole idea of organizing itself to support local village guards actually never took hold. And when we started to pull out, the program only lasted 3 years. And when we started to pull out, and there was no QRF anymore, no quick reaction force to support the Arbakais, the program basically fell apart.
It brings back memories. In 2013, 2012 and 2013, I was on active duty in Kabul as a Marine colonel on the ISAF commander staff, working on the anti-Taliban uprisings, how to support them. Some may remember that in Ghazni and other places, these uprisings started spontaneously. And when I briefed the ISAF commander, I said, we have a good problem. We have more people, more areas that want to create local self-defense forces than at the time we had special forces A teams and other special operations forces to be able to team with them and to help them. So in the end, VSO did show the way, and as you mentioned, did have a great impact out in the countryside. I would like to now turn back to Dr. Zori. And your paper also talked about working with militias and local police in the Iraqi context, and it had a number of lessons learned. Would you be willing to speak to us about the lessons learned from the Iraqi side of regarding working with police and local militias to defeat an insurgency?
Yes, of course. So, what I looked at when I was writing my paper was highly concentrated on the 2006, 7, and 8 timeframe in Iraq. And in this timeframe, what you saw was that Al-Qaeda really controlled a lot of the land and a lot of the area, especially in Sunni populated areas. And it was around this time that you saw what is now termed the Anbar Awakening, where what commanders on the ground saw, battalion commander level commanders, was that if they worked with local sheikhs and they actually got some of the local forces to defend their own territory, they would actually be the ones who could get young men to join in the security apparatus, find Al-Qaeda and rout them out. I focused a lot on how this came to Baghdad, which it came to Baghdad maybe 6 months to a year after the Anbar Awakening. And what you saw was the same phenomenon where battalion level commanders would meet with local leaders and sheikhs and start to self-organize these local police forces. Now, a lot of these folks have been taken off the payroll because they had been Baathists at some point or they had been in the Baathist apparatus. So a lot of them were out of work. And what we saw was some great success once these folks were on the payroll and once these folks were engaged in fighting Al Qaeda. Now, there's some nuances to this that my research shows. So, first is that, and this is the most important lesson probably in all the Iraq War, is that unless an entity is unless backed by an overwhelming occupation force, dismantling an existing security structure is probably going to lead to a security vacuum. And that's really at a policy level. So if you, for instance, take down a security structure, what's going to fill that security structure? It's probably going to be malicious entities. Second, and this is something that I think a lot of folks learned the hard way, but once you have an insurgent organization, it doesn't mean that that organization is completely uniform. You can actually find cleavages within those organizations and exploit them. So this would be like a divide and conquer methodology. And once you realize that Al Qaeda was not a monolith, that there were ideological cleavages, that there were people who wanted to leave Al Qaeda, that there were people who were on the fence about aligning with Al Qaeda, that all Sunnis were not a monolith. You could exploit the ideological cleavages within these organizations and use it to realign groups. Third, what my research revealed was that it's really important to balance some sort of speed with a sustainable action. So doing things like restoring basic services once services have been taken out is really important if you want to establish your legitimacy as a occupation organization or as a force that's getting rid of a group like Al Qaeda. But building anything meaningful like long-term stability operations is extremely difficult. So when you're trying to build institutions modeled after US institutions, this is extremely hard. But turning on the water, turning on the electricity, this can give you a quick win and it can make you seem much more legitimate with the people. Fourth, it's really important to align your political and military strategies. So when military operations are not completely aligned with local political realities, it can create a lot of unintended consequences. And finally, one of the biggest lessons learned from my experience is that if you abandon these allies that you create on the ground, so for instance, we created this organization, the Sons of Iraq, which was part of the Sunni Tribal Awakening. It's also called the Sahwa movement. These folks, a lot of them became very loyal to the United States. They wanted to fight with the United States. They were excited about being on the side of the United States, but we ended up abandoning a lot of these allies that we created for many various reasons. But when you do something like that, it can lead to very disastrous consequences down the road. And a lot of the folks that we abandoned ended up joining organizations like Islamic State.
Thank you, Diane. Arturo, what do you consider the main lessons learned from your experiences of working with local militias and local police forces in Afghanistan? Things that we should remember in the future, should we ever try this again?
Well, I think that the most important lesson is you got to rely on local people. You can't do counterinsurgency without the involvement of local people. If you rely solely on uniformed government troops, you're going to be at a big disadvantage. The other lesson is the CDF, the Civilian Defense Forces. This is not unique to Afghanistan. I mean, they've done this all over the world. I don't view them as synonymous with militias. And I think that when we did go in there and try to do that with the special forces, and there was a very successful effort by special forces to work with these local village guards they provided training, they provided weapons. They did want to fight the Taliban, but we didn't follow through. And I think sustainability is the other big lesson, and a long-term commitment. The big problem that we had, which you alluded to, is that there were never enough special forces, and they also had Marines, by the way, that participated in this effort. But there was never enough of them, and the thing is, the U.S. Army and I would say the U.S. government in general never really committed to this idea of working with local people as the primary strategy. I mean, they're always wedded to this idea of a national army, which at the end of the day didn't work. So, sustainability and long-term commitment is a big issue. We only did it for 3 years. That's not enough time. And you have to really commit to the idea of local defense forces. Don't use them as an ancillary thing, as a secondary thing. You really have to decide, how are we going to confront insurgents in a foreign government? And I think that's something that at the end of the day we failed.
Thank you, Arturo. Dr. Zori, with the benefit of hindsight and time to reflect on our experiences in Iraq, what could you tell our audience was the best thing you saw regarding our utilization of Iraqi police and militia forces to counter the terrorist insurgency? And what was the biggest mistake we made in the context of the war in Iraq regarding
It's
police and militias use?
This is a great question because 2020 is always a little bit more clear than it is when you're in the moment. But I think one of the most effective policies during the entire Iraq war was actually instigating the Sunni tribal awakening. I think without the Sunni tribal awakening, we wouldn't have been able to achieve what we did in Iraq. And I think that using the Sunnis to stabilize their own territory was a great success. One thing that I want to point out, and I think Arturo also alluded to this, is that the incentivization to get local forces to join your cause is quite complex. And while in some cases monetary incentives can incentivize people to join your cause, it's not usually the only thing, and it's not always the first thing. So in my research, what I show is that in the initial spark of a awakening, like we had with the Sunni awakening, the incentive wasn't actually monetary. There was actually a lot of grievances, and there was an ideological desire to sort of switch sides. Over time, this became a security business, mainly because these folks were unemployed and they needed something to do with their time. And this keeping the peace was basically turning them into, this was a job. So we had to pay them at some point. Otherwise, Al Qaeda was going to pay them more. So we wanted to employ these folks. It became a security business over time. The biggest mistake, in my opinion, and I think academics and policymakers now are unanimous in this assessment, it was the disbanding of the Iraqi army and security forces under CPA Order Number 2. This was the greatest mistake of the Iraq War because it dismantled a functioning system, a functioning security apparatus, and it put a vast pool of people, unemployed, armed, and aggrieved, into sort of oblivion. So I think the resulting power vacuum is really what fueled that insurgency. But a close second to that big mistake, I think, was the failure to prevent Iran from expanding its influence within Iraq's security apparatus, especially after the U.S. withdrawal. So what we did, unintentionally or intentionally, I'm not sure, was empower a majority ethno-sectarian faction that was sympathetic to Iranian objectives. And so we actually facilitated Tehran's deep penetration into Iraq, into their military, and into their political institutions. And this miscalculation continues to exacerbate instability in the region because Iran has now carte blanche to do what it wants in Iraq without anything to push back on that influence.
Diane, your comments about the incentives for the Sons of Iraq and for the local police and that, and at that time, bring back a lot of memories. In 2007, I was in uniform in Al Anbar province. I was the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force provincial advisor. to the Al Anbar government and to the governor there. And when I arrived in February 2007, there had just been the horrific murders of a number of children of policemen. And a lot of people had thought that, well, that would just further intimidate the police, which was in shambles at the time. But as the awakening movement rose, as leadership started to arise, and as the local sheikhs realized that they were about to lose their power to the Al Qaeda terrorists, i.e., warfare is all about politics. There were people who with the incentive to fight back, and the incentive was not money. And we had so many people who were willing to join that we had an easy time of as a matter of fact, the hardest part was two hardest parts. So we're getting the Iraqi government, the Ministry of Interior, to fund the number of slots for police, people that were willing to serve in the police, which was a risky business in Al Anbar province in 2007. And then the logistics of training and equipping them. We used short sleeve light blue shirts, the type used by the Air Force and the Coast Guard. We got them from the Defense Logistics Agency and gave them to these policemen to be part of their uniform, because they have some sort of way to distinguish them from their regular dress. And we got word later on that summer in 2007 that it had become almost impossible in the exchanges in Washington, D.C. and other areas for U.S. Air Force and Coast Guard people to find short sleeve shirts, uniform shirts, because they had all been sent out there to Al Anbar province. Arturo, I want to turn to you with pretty much the same question. Based on your personal experiences and research, what was the best thing you saw regarding our efforts to create and support local militia forces to fight the Taliban? And again, what was the biggest mistake you made? You've alluded to a few, but where did we go right and where did we go wrong in the end?
Well, the best thing we did is that we embraced the traditional Pashtun cultural system for village self-defense, the Arakai, and decided to create a project based on the local culture and things. The Arakai have been there for centuries, and I think that was the right thing to do. And also, you mentioned that in Iraq, in your experience, there were a lot of Iraqis who did want to fight the insurgents. We saw the same thing in Afghanistan. I don't think people realize that there was a lot of willingness in the Afghan countryside to actually take on the Taliban. A lot of the local Pashtun tribal leaders didn't want to live under Taliban rule. I mean, these are theocratic dictators, and they didn't want that. And as a matter of fact, I remember getting reports where the local villages would actually contact the U.S. military and say, we want to be officially recognized as allies, because when they're out in the field with their AKs and not in any kind of uniform, they didn't want to be mistaken by U.S. planes as Taliban, and they didn't want to be strafed by U.S. planes. So they said, look, put us on a list that we're on your side so we can go out and patrol armed and not be confused with the enemy, because we want to fight the enemy. So the whole VSO tapped into that, and that was the right thing to do. What was the worst thing we did? We didn't follow up. We didn't have enough special forces ODAs. We had very few, actually. And as time went on, you had a rotating system where they would train these village self-defense forces, arm them, and then go to another village, because we didn't have enough. And the basic issue there is, which we mentioned before, we as a U.S. government didn't really commit to this strategy. We did it as a secondary thing. And my point is, it should have been a primary part of our strategy, not an add-on to the basic conventional war that we waged, which in the end didn't work.
Thank you, Arturo. Diane, today, the national security establishment, the military, everyone is concentrating today on what we call peer-on-peer conflicts, China, Russia, these sorts of events. Just as after Vietnam, no one wanted to take the lessons learned from that war, and many said, "Well, we'll never fight another war like that again." That's kind of an undercurrent in the national security establishment. But anyone who studies history knows that the United States most likely will be involved in a counterinsurgency operation sometime in the future. So I'm going to ask you for some final thoughts on what you would advise a theater commander in the future who has just inherited a counterinsurgency mission, and what you would advise that theater commander to do.
This is a great question, and I agree with you. I think the shift towards great power competition probably will deprioritize counterinsurgency, at least in the short term, which definitely risks another cycle of forgetting and relearning in future conflicts. But if I was to advise a theater commander inheriting a counterinsurgency mission, I would tend to think that if they're given enough autonomy, they probably will know what to do. But the biggest piece of advice I would give them is to empower brigade and battalion commanders to make very quick decisions on the ground and get ahead of the insurgents. This is mainly because counterinsurgency is so fluid. And if you're locking in on rigid strategies, you're probably going to be destined to fail. So you have to be willing to adjust very quickly. And you can't necessarily do that from the theater level. You have to empower down the chain of command. Second, I would say that from what I've witnessed, it's truly the policymakers that probably need the advice the most, because it's the policymakers that made so many of the mistakes that led to so much instability in the region. And for them, I would say, one, don't get involved in counterinsurgency, but if you do, do it with enough people. Don't take away the existing security apparatus. Don't dismantle it unless you have a really well-planned alternative. Identify and build relationships with local power brokers, but vet them very carefully. Look for the quick wins that will make you legitimate. Ensure that your military actions always align with political realities. Recognize that sustaining your long-term commitments to the security of your allies is probably going to be very difficult. You can make that effort, but inevitably there are going to be many people that are disappointed in the long run. And finally, I would say, I don't know, counterinsurgency is so fluid. So you definitely, again, I'll just reiterate the first point, empower your battalion and brigade commanders to the maximum extent possible.
Thank you. And I just add one slight modification to your suggestion is do it with enough local people when you're fighting the counterinsurgency, because it should always be their war. Arturo, same question, but I'll taking Dr. Zori's advice. What would you advise policymakers who have to make decisions regarding a possible future counterinsurgency mission somewhere in the world that the U.S. is involved in with regards to the use of local security forces?
Well, the first thing that I would argue is actually just reinforcing the point that has been made is you got to rely on local forces. You can't expect the U.S. Army, the U.S. Marines to go to a foreign country and fight foreign insurgents indefinitely. I mean, there's a question of again, sustainability, long-term commitment. Before you deploy U.S. forces, I mean, you really ought to understand the situation. Why is there an insurgency? What are the causes of the insurgency? How popular is the insurgency? Does the insurgency have strong local support? So basically, the first step is analysis. Know what you're doing, know what you're getting into. And time again, when you read these, assessments of, what we did wrong, like in the CIGAR reports, like almost every CIGAR report says, we didn't understand Afghanistan. We didn't understand local culture. We didn't understand the local history. So the first thing that I would argue is, well, get that understanding of the foreign place that you want to intervene in. There's that famous exchange with the Vietnamese and Robert McNamara after the war, where they asked him, well, why did you get involved in Vietnam? We're not against you. This is a Vietnamese communist talking to Robert McNamara after the war. And he said, well, it was about China. We didn't want to have the Chinese expansion. And they said, Have you never read a history book? Don't you know that Vietnam and China have been fighting for 1,000 years? Well, that same problem, it was present in Afghanistan. We didn't understand Afghanistan. We went in there with our agenda, our ideas in our head as to what the Afghan reality was, and we didn't understand the Afghan reality. So your first order of business is understand the place that you want to intervene in.
Thank you very much. Dr. Zori, Dr. Munoz, thank you both so much for this discussion and for sharing your research and experience with us. It's been an honor to have you both on our program. Before I conclude, I would like to let our listeners know that you can find both Dr. Zori's and Dr. Munoz's papers that we've talked about today on the FPRI website. The website has also published or will be publishing several other papers from the Irregular Warfare Lessons Learned conference that was held last September. If you are interested, you can find them at fpri.org. As always, at the end of each podcast, I would like to thank you, our audience, for checking in to listen to Overheard to get different perspectives on intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. We look forward to bringing you a full slate of interesting topics as the year 2025 unfolds in these areas. We hope you'll continue to tune in and recommend us to your friends. If you enjoy these podcasts, please visit the Foreign Policy Research Institute website at fpri.org to subscribe to our mailing list to receive updates on future podcasts and other FPRI events. We hope you will join us next month for a new Overheard podcast. Goodbye.